Before there was a name that could be spoken as Germany, there was land, and long stretches of quiet time in which human presence left only the lightest trace. Dense forests covered much of Central Europe, broken by rivers that moved slowly and predictably through the seasons. The Rhine, the Elbe, the Danube. These waterways were not borders yet, but paths. They carried fish, reeds, mist, and eventually people, long before they carried power or identity. Early human settlement in this region followed the logic of survival rather than ambition. Small communities formed near water and fertile soil, adapting themselves to cold winters and mild summers. Life moved in cycles, planting, harvesting, hunting, waiting. There was no sense of a shared destiny beyond the village, no idea of a nation or even a people unified by language or belief. What existed instead was a quiet continuity, shaped by climate, terrain, and the slow accumulation of experience passed from one generation to the next. Over time, these landscapes encouraged both separation and connection. Thick forests isolated groups from one another, allowing distinct customs and dialects to form. At the same time, rivers and valleys made movement possible, gently drawing communities into contact. Trade emerged not as commerce in the modern sense, but as exchange, tools for food, amber for metal, knowledge for trust. These early interactions laid down invisible threads that would later be pulled tight by larger forces. Archaeological traces suggest that by the late prehistoric period, Central Europe was already a mosaic of cultures rather than a single world. Burial practices differed from region to region. Some communities emphasized weapons and status in death, others simplicity and ritual. None of this pointed toward a future Germany, yet all of it mattered. The habits formed in these centuries, the respect for land, the endurance through hardship, the balance between isolation and exchange, would echo quietly far into the future. As centuries passed, populations grew and technology improved. Iron tools replaced stone, forests were slowly cleared, and paths widened into routes. Still, power remained local. Authority rested with elders, warriors, or chieftains, whose influence rarely extended far beyond their immediate surroundings. Conflict existed, but it was limited in scale, shaped more by necessity than conquest. The idea of dominating vast territories had not yet taken hold. What is striking about this early period is its patience. Change came slowly, almost imperceptibly. Yet beneath this calm surface, the conditions were forming for something more dynamic. The openness of the land to movement, the resilience of its people, and the absence of fixed political structures made the region both stable and vulnerable. When more organized powers began to look northward, they would not encounter emptiness, but a world quietly prepared for disruption. And so, without realizing it, these early landscapes and communities stood at the edge of a long transformation. The forests remained, the rivers continued their steady flow, but beyond the horizon, a new kind of power was beginning to move, one that would soon press against these lands and begin to define them in new ways. As the centuries turned, the quiet rhythm of Central Europe began to change under the distant but persistent presence of Rome. To the south and west, a vast empire had grown accustomed to roads, laws, and administration, and its borders slowly edged closer to the forests and rivers of the Germanic world. Contact did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments. Traders, scouts, diplomats, soldiers, each carrying with them unfamiliar ideas about order and power. For the peoples living beyond the Rhine and Danube, Rome was both a curiosity and a pressure. Roman goods found their way into Germanic settlements: coins, glassware, weapons of superior craftsmanship. These objects did more than serve practical needs. They subtly reshaped social hierarchies. Leaders who could control access to Roman trade gained prestige, and influence began to extend further than before. Yet, Roman culture itself did not fully cross the frontier. What developed instead was a long, uneven relationship defined by exchange, imitation, and resistance. The Romans, for their part, never fully understood the societies they encountered. They grouped diverse tribes under broad labels, calling them Germanic, as if they were a single people. In reality, these groups differed in language, custom, and loyalty. Some cooperated with Rome, serving as auxiliaries in its armies. Others remained hostile, retreating deeper into the forests, where Roman formations struggled to move. The frontier became less a clear line and more a zone of constant negotiation. This tension reached a turning point in the early 1st century. Rome attempted not merely to influence the region, but to absorb it. Roads were pushed forward, forts established, and Roman administration tentatively imposed. For a brief moment it seemed possible that much of Germania would follow the path of Gaul, becoming another Roman province. But the land and its people resisted, in ways that were not immediately visible. The decisive moment came in a forest, far from the stone cities of the Mediterranean world. In the year 9 CE, Roman legions moving through unfamiliar terrain were ambushed and destroyed by a coalition of Germanic warriors. The defeat was more than military. It shattered Rome's confidence in the region and fixed the Rhine as a psychological boundary. From that point on, Rome defended rather than advanced. In the aftermath, contact did not end. Trade continued, and Roman influence lingered along the frontier for centuries. But something had shifted. Germanic societies, shaped by their interactions with Rome, began to see themselves more clearly in contrast to an external power. Leadership grew more centralized, warfare more organized, and identity more defined, even if still fluid. As Roman authority stabilized along its borders, the Germanic world beyond remained in motion. Tribes formed, dissolved, and reformed. Alliances changed with the seasons. Beneath this movement lay a growing awareness of strength born not from cities or laws, but from adaptability. It was an awareness that would matter greatly when Roman power itself began to weaken, and the balance between empire and frontier slowly reversed. When Roman authority began to fade, it did not disappear suddenly. It thinned, weakened by distance, internal strain, and the long effort of holding together a vast empire. Along the northern frontiers, forts were abandoned, roads fell quiet, and the steady flow of pay and supplies slowed. For the Germanic peoples beyond the Rhine and Danube, this gradual withdrawal created a new kind of space, one filled with opportunity, uncertainty, and movement. The centuries that followed were marked by migration rather than conquest in the traditional sense. Groups moved not as unified nations, but as shifting communities responding to pressure from climate changes, population growth, and the movement of others behind them. Goths, Vandals, Franks, Alemanni, and many more passed through Roman lands or settled within them. Some sought safety, others land, others a place within the structures Rome had built. As Roman administration weakened, these groups began to fill the vacuum. They did not destroy Roman order so much as inherit fragments of it. Former Roman officials negotiated with tribal leaders. Roman law continued in altered forms. Latin remained the language of record in many areas. What emerged was not a clean break, but a blending, a slow transformation of Roman provinces into early medieval kingdoms. In the regions that would later be considered German lands, power took on a personal character. Authority rested on loyalty between leaders and followers rather than on institutions. Kings ruled through reputation, generosity, and success in war. Their courts moved with them, and governance was inseparable from presence. Stability depended less on borders than on relationships, and those relationships were fragile. Christianity, carried northward during this period, added another layer to the changing world. Conversion was uneven and often pragmatic. Leaders adopted the new faith to strengthen alliances or legitimize rule, while older beliefs lingered among the population. Over time, Christian institutions, churches, monasteries, bishops, provided continuity where political structures could not. They preserved learning, recorded events, and offered a sense of order that transcended local power struggles. By the early Middle Ages, the idea of a unified German realm still did not exist. What existed instead was a patchwork of kingdoms, each shaped by its own history and circumstances. Among them, the Franks gradually rose to prominence. Their ability to combine military strength with administrative continuity allowed them to dominate much of Central and Western Europe. Yet even their rule remained flexible, adapting to local traditions rather than erasing them. This period was often later remembered as chaotic, but from within it felt like adaptation. Communities learned to survive without imperial protection. New identities formed, rooted in land, faith, and allegiance rather than empire. The world was smaller, more immediate, and more uncertain, but it was also resilient. As generations passed, one Frankish dynasty in particular began to gather authority in a way that hinted at something larger. Through conquest, diplomacy, and faith, it would soon reshape much of Europe, and in doing so, lay foundations that would quietly define the future of the German lands. Out of the shifting world of early medieval kingdoms, one figure gradually came to stand above the rest, not only as a ruler, but as a symbol of order returning to Europe. Charlemagne did not inherit a stable realm. He assembled one through patience, force, and an unusual ability to bind loyalty to a larger vision. Under his rule, the Frankish world expanded eastward into territories that would later be central to German history. Charlemagne's authority rested on movement. He traveled constantly, holding court wherever he happened to be, reinforcing his presence through ceremony and judgment. His rule was personal, yet it reached further than that of earlier kings. Through appointed counts and loyal nobles, he extended governance across vast areas, balancing local customs with imperial expectations. In the eastern regions, newly incorporated into his realm, this process began to knit together lands that had long existed separately. Equally important was his relationship with the Church. By aligning his rule with Christian authority, Charlemagne gained legitimacy that transcended tribal boundaries. Monasteries were founded, bishoprics established, and learning encouraged. Latin texts were copied, laws written down, and education promoted among clergy and administrators. This effort did not create uniformity, but it created a shared framework, one that connected distant regions through faith and written tradition. In the year 800, Charlemagne was crowned emperor, an act that carried deep symbolic weight. It suggested a revival of Roman imperial authority in the West, yet it was not Rome reborn. This new empire was rural, decentralized, and dependent on personal bonds. Still, the idea mattered. It planted the notion that authority in Central Europe could be both sacred and expansive, rooted in Christian kingship rather than ancient empire. After Charlemagne's death, this carefully balanced system began to strain. His successors lacked his authority, and the empire was divided among heirs according to custom. One of these divisions, East Francia, encompassed much of what would later become Germany. It was not yet a nation, but it was a political space with shared rulers, shared challenges, and a growing sense of distinction from the western and southern realms. In East Francia, kings faced a difficult task. They ruled over powerful regional nobles, each with their own interests and traditions. Control depended on negotiation as much as command. Over time, the Eastern Kingdom developed its own patterns of leadership, shaped by the need to manage diversity rather than erase it. This flexibility would become a defining feature of German political life. As the memory of Charlemagne faded into legend, the structures he left behind endured in altered form. The idea of an empire tied to Christian legitimacy remained, even as real power fragmented. From this tension between unity and division, authority and autonomy, a new political entity slowly took shape. It would soon be given a name that suggested universality and sacred purpose, yet in practice it would remain deeply regional. The Holy Roman Empire was not yet fully formed, but its outlines were becoming visible, and with them a long chapter in the history of the German lands quietly began. The Holy Roman Empire emerged not as a single moment of creation, but as a gradual acceptance of an idea that had already taken root. It was meant to represent a universal Christian order, guided by an emperor who stood between heaven and earth, protecting the church while ruling over diverse lands. In reality, it became a delicate balance between ambition and limitation, especially within the German-speaking regions at its core. Imperial authority depended heavily on consent. The emperor was not simply born into unquestioned power, he was chosen by leading nobles, whose support came with expectations and conditions. This electoral nature shaped the empire from the beginning. Power was shared, negotiated, and often contested. Local rulers, dukes, princes, bishops, retained significant autonomy, governing their territories according to regional customs while acknowledging the emperor in theory. The Church played a central role in this system. Bishops and abbots were not only spiritual leaders but also territorial lords, controlling lands and resources. Their dual role made them valuable allies for emperors seeking to counterbalance hereditary nobles. Yet this arrangement carried risks. Disputes over who held the authority to appoint church officials led to prolonged conflicts, most notably between emperors and popes, each claiming ultimate legitimacy. These struggles were not abstract. They shaped everyday life in the German lands. When emperors and popes clashed, loyalties fractured. Cities chose sides, nobles shifted allegiances, and regions endured uncertainty. At times, imperial authority seemed strong, capable of mobilizing armies and enforcing order. At other moments, it appeared distant, symbolic, and ineffective. Despite this fragmentation, the empire provided continuity. It offered a shared legal and cultural framework that connected regions from the North Sea to the Alps. Imperial courts settled disputes. Imperial diets brought rulers together, and imperial symbols reinforced the idea of belonging to something larger. For many, the empire was less a governing power than a backdrop, a structure that shaped expectations even when it failed to act decisively. German lands within the empire developed a strong sense of regional identity. Saxony, Bavaria, Swabia, and others maintained distinct traditions, laws, and dialects. This diversity was not suppressed. It was absorbed into the imperial model. Unity existed, but it was loose, flexible, and often strained. The absence of a strong central authority allowed local cultures to flourish, but it also limited coordinated action. Over time, this balance became a defining characteristic. While other parts of Europe moved toward centralized kingdoms, the German lands remained a complex network of overlapping authorities. This structure fostered resilience and adaptability, but it also carried the seeds of future tension, especially as economic and social change accelerated. As medieval society evolved, new forces began to reshape this world. Towns grew, trade expanded, and people increasingly found identity not only in land and lord, but in community and craft. These quieter changes would gradually shift the center of gravity within the empire, preparing the way for transformations that would come not from emperors or popes, but from the streets and marketplaces of medieval towns. As the medieval centuries unfolded, life in the German lands began to turn slowly outward, away from purely rural rhythms and toward the steady pulse of towns. This change did not announce itself loudly. It crept forward with the sound of carts on stone streets, the ringing of church bells marking hours rather than seasons, and the quiet confidence of merchants who traveled farther each year than their parents ever had. Towns grew where trade naturally gathered, along rivers, crossroads, and coastal inlets. Some were ancient Roman foundations revived after centuries of decline, others entirely new creations. Within their walls, a different kind of order took shape. Guilds regulated crafts, councils governed local affairs, and laws were written to protect commerce and property. For the first time, many people lived under rules shaped not by noble lineage, but by collective agreement. The rise of towns altered the balance of power within the Holy Roman Empire. Wealth no longer flowed only from land and agriculture. It moved through trade, credit, and skilled labor. Cities that controlled key routes or markets gained influence far beyond their size. In northern Germany, this process led to the formation of powerful trade networks, most notably the Hanseatic League, which linked dozens of towns across the Baltic and North Seas. The Hanseatic cities were not a state, yet they acted with shared purpose. They protected trade, negotiated treaties, and even waged limited wars to defend commercial interests. Their power rested on cooperation rather than conquest, and their influence reshaped daily life. Goods from distant regions, grain, timber, salt, cloth, circulated through German towns, connecting them to a wider European world. Urban life also changed how people understood themselves. Identity became layered. A person might be loyal to a local lord, respectful of the emperor, faithful to the church, and deeply attached to their city all at once. Education expanded as literacy became useful for trade and administration. Universities appeared, drawing students into networks of shared learning that crossed political boundaries. Yet this growth brought tension. Towns sought greater independence from local nobles, often clashing with them over taxes, rights, and authority. Peasants, watching wealth concentrate behind city walls, grew increasingly aware of inequality. The church, wealthy and powerful, faced quiet resentment from those who saw a gap between spiritual teaching and lived reality. Still, the overall movement was gradual rather than explosive. The medieval German world adapted, absorbing change without losing its underlying structure. The empire remained fragmented, but it was also increasingly interconnected. Ideas, goods, and people moved more freely than before, softening older boundaries even as new ones emerged. By the late Middle Ages, the German lands stood at a quiet threshold. Beneath the surface of routine, markets opening at dawn, prayers spoken at dusk, questions were forming about authority, faith, and fairness. These questions were not yet openly voiced, but they were spreading patiently, carried by sermons, books, and conversation. In time, they would converge around belief itself, reshaping not only religion, but the political and social fabric of the German world. The calm order of medieval life was still intact, but it was beginning, almost imperceptibly, to lean toward change. The changes that followed did not arrive with sudden violence, but with words, spoken, written, and quietly repeated. By the early 16th century, the German lands were filled with unease that had no single source. Faith remained central to daily life, yet trust in religious authority had grown thin. Many felt that the Church, vast and powerful, had drifted away from the simplicity it once preached. This sense did not begin as rebellion. It began as reflection. The structure of the Holy Roman Empire allowed such reflection to spread. Its decentralization meant that ideas could take root in one territory without being immediately crushed by another. When a monk and scholar named Martin Luther questioned certain church practices, especially the selling of indulgences, his challenge resonated widely. Printing presses, already established in German cities, carried his arguments far beyond their point of origin, moving faster than authority could follow. What made the Reformation distinctive in the German lands was not only theology, but politics. Local rulers saw in these religious debates an opportunity to assert greater independence from both the Pope and the Emperor. By adopting new forms of worship, they could claim control over church lands and institutions within their territories. Faith and power became closely intertwined, each shaping the other in ways that were not always openly acknowledged. For ordinary people, the Reformation altered the texture of daily life. Services were held in local languages rather than Latin. Sermons emphasized personal faith and direct engagement with Scripture. Education gained new importance as reading became a spiritual act. At the same time, communities were divided. Neighbors who had shared rituals for generations now found themselves on different sides of belief. The emperor sought to preserve unity, but compromise proved difficult. Religious settlements were negotiated, allowing rulers to choose the faith of their territories, yet these arrangements solved little in the long term. They froze divisions rather than healing them. Beneath formal agreements, distrust lingered, and alliances hardened along confessional lines. The Reformation did not replace one certainty with another. Instead, it opened a space of permanent questioning. Authority was no longer singular. Truth seemed closer yet more contested. This ambiguity shaped the German lands deeply, reinforcing their tradition of regional difference, while weakening any sense of uniform identity. As decades passed, religious difference became entangled with dynastic ambition and foreign influence. What had begun as a call for reform slowly accumulated the weight of unresolved tension. Armies were raised in the name of faith, treaties signed with hesitation, and peace maintained only through fragile balance. By the early 17th century, this balance could no longer hold. The German lands stood crowded with memories of grievance and fear, layered over generations. When conflict finally broke through, it would not be brief or contained. It would spread slowly, relentlessly, and leave marks that would endure long after the fighting stopped. reshaping the land and its people in ways they could not yet imagine. When war finally arrived, it did not come as a single declaration, but as a gradual unraveling of restraint. What became known as the 30 Years' War began with a local conflict rooted in religious and political tension, yet it soon expanded far beyond its origins. The German lands, positioned at the heart of Europe, became the stage upon which wider ambitions were played out. At first, many believed the fighting would be limited. Armies moved with familiar purpose, rulers spoke of defense rather than conquest, and communities tried to endure as they always had. But the war did not move cleanly from battle to battle. It lingered. It returned. It settled into daily life. Soldiers required food, shelter, and payment, whether friend or foe. Villages were stripped bare not once, but repeatedly. The structure of the Holy Roman Empire made coordination difficult. Imperial authority was too weak to impose a unified response, and regional rulers pursued their own survival. Foreign powers entered the conflict, drawn by opportunity as much as belief. What began as a struggle over faith evolved into a contest for influence, with the German lands bearing the weight of both. For civilians, the war was experienced not in grand strategies, but in absence. Fields went unplanted, trade routes fell silent, and families were scattered. Disease followed armies, spreading faster than news. Entire regions lost large portions of their population, not through a single catastrophe, but through accumulation, hunger, illness, exhaustion. Cities fared little better than the countryside. Walls offered limited protection against prolonged strain. Resources dwindled, and civic life narrowed to survival. The social fabric stretched thin as trust eroded and fear shaped behavior. Faith, once a source of certainty, became complicated by suffering that seemed without meaning or end. When the war finally concluded in 1648, it did not bring triumph. The Peace of Westphalia was less a celebration than a quiet acknowledgment of limits. It confirmed religious divisions and strengthened the autonomy of regional rulers. For the German lands, it marked the end of any serious hope for centralized imperial authority in the near future. Recovery was slow. Population levels took generations to rebuild. Towns and villages redefined themselves with fewer people and altered priorities. Memory of the war lingered, shaping attitudes toward power, stability, and compromise. Caution became a habit, and the cost of disorder was deeply understood. Out of this exhaustion emerged a new kind of political thinking. Rulers focused on administration, discipline, and efficiency, seeking to prevent chaos rather than pursue universal ideals. Among the many German states, one in particular began to embody this shift, quietly building strength through organization rather than spectacle. In the long calm that followed the war, attention turned away from faith as a cause of conflict and toward governance as a means of survival. The stage was being set for a different transformation, one driven not by belief alone, but by reason, reform, and the careful management of power. After decades of destruction, the German lands entered a period defined less by vision than by recovery. The priority was order. Fields were reclaimed, towns rebuilt, and administrations strengthened. Rulers who had witnessed the cost of instability turned inward, focusing on control, predictability, and endurance. In this quieter age, power became practical rather than symbolic. Among the many German states, Prussia gradually distinguished itself. Its lands were scattered and its resources limited, yet its leaders responded by cultivating discipline and efficiency. Administration was tightened, taxation regularized, and the military reorganized into a permanent institution rather than a temporary force. Service to the state became a defining expectation, shaping both governance and society. This emphasis on order extended beyond the army. Education was promoted to create capable administrators and officers. Laws were standardized, and religious tolerance, though limited, was often practiced out of necessity. The goal was not ideological unity, but functionality. The state existed to survive in a competitive environment, and survival required competence. At the same time, the ideas of the Enlightenment began to circulate through German intellectual life. Philosophers, writers, and scholars explored reason, natural law, and the structure of society. These discussions did not always challenge authority directly. Instead, they often sought to improve it, imagining a world governed by rational principles rather than inherited privilege alone. German universities became important centers of this thought. Unlike in some other parts of Europe, intellectual life was closely tied to the state. Scholars advised rulers, reformed education, and contributed to legal and administrative modernization. The result was a distinctive blend of intellectual freedom and political caution. For ordinary people, change was subtle. Daily life remained shaped by local custom and obligation. Yet the presence of a more organized state was increasingly felt. In schools, in courts, in taxation. Authority was less arbitrary but also more pervasive. The relationship between ruler and subject grew more structured, less personal. By the late 18th century, the German lands were more stable than they had been in generations, but they were also increasingly aware of the world beyond their borders. Ideas of citizenship, rights, and national identity began to appear in conversation, though rarely in action. The empire still existed, but it felt old, its flexibility now resembling stagnation. Then, from the west, a force arrived that would disrupt this careful balance. It carried with it not only armies, but a new way of imagining power, law, and identity. The German states, long accustomed to gradual change, would soon be compelled to adapt rapidly. As the shock of revolution and conquest reached deep into the heart of Central Europe, the arrival of Napoleon's armies was experienced less as an invasion than as a sudden acceleration of history. Structures that had endured for centuries were confronted with ideas that moved quickly and demanded clarity. Old allegiances faltered, and long-standing institutions found themselves unable to respond with the speed required. The German lands, accustomed to gradual adjustment, were forced into rapid transformation. Napoleon's influence extended beyond military occupation. Where his authority reached, laws were rewritten, privileges abolished, and administration simplified. The complex patchwork of imperial territories was reduced, consolidated, and reorganized. For many rulers, this reordering was humiliating, yet for others, it offered opportunity. Smaller states disappeared, while a few larger ones gained coherence and strength. The Holy Roman Empire, already weakened, could not survive this pressure. In 1806, it was formally dissolved, ending an institution that had shaped German history for nearly 1,000 years. Its disappearance was quiet, almost anticlimactic, yet deeply symbolic. An old framework was gone, and nothing equally familiar stood in its place. For ordinary people, the changes were contradictory. Serfdom was weakened or abolished in some regions. Equality before the law was proclaimed, at least in theory. At the same time, war brought hardship, conscription, and economic strain. Liberation and domination arrived together, difficult to separate in daily experience. As Napoleon's power waned, German rulers and thinkers reflected on what had been lost and gained. The defeat of France did not restore the old order. Instead, a new arrangement emerged at the Congress of Vienna, emphasizing balance and stability over innovation. German lands were grouped into a loose confederation, designed to prevent both fragmentation and excessive unity. Yet beneath this settlement, something had shifted. The experience of reform and occupation had awakened a sense of shared culture and language. Intellectuals spoke increasingly of a German people, connected not by empire, but by history, literature, and memory. This idea remained abstract, but it persisted quietly. The 19th century opened with restraint, but not stillness. Economic change, education, and communication continued to bind regions together. The question of unity lingered, unresolved yet increasingly present. It did not demand immediate answers, but it waited patiently, gathering strength as generations passed. In time, this quiet pressure would be taken up by states with the means to act, transforming cultural awareness into political reality. The path toward unity was not yet clear, but its direction was slowly, steadily forming. As the 19th century advanced, the idea of unity began to move from thought into practice, though not without hesitation. The German lands were changing quietly but decisively. Railways stitched regions together, reducing distance and time. Markets expanded beyond local boundaries, and industry drew populations toward new centers of work. Economic life was becoming shared, even as political life remained divided. Prussia emerged as a focal point in this evolving landscape. Its earlier emphasis on administration and discipline now found new purpose in industrial growth and military reform. Through a customs union that removed internal trade barriers, Prussia helped create an economic space that many German states depended upon, whether they welcomed the arrangement or not. Unity arrived first through commerce rather than ideology. Political movements also gained momentum, though cautiously. Calls for constitutional rule and national representation surfaced, particularly during the revolutions of 1848. These uprisings reflected widespread frustration, but they lacked coordination and lasting power. When they faded, many concluded that unity could not be achieved through idealism alone. It would require authority, strategy, and patience. This belief shaped the actions of Prussia's leadership in the following decades. Under firm guidance, the state pursued unification not through broad consensus, but through carefully managed conflict. Short, decisive wars were fought against neighboring powers, each one altering the balance of influence among German states. These conflicts were framed as defensive or necessary, yet they steadily reduced opposition to Prussian leadership. In 1871, after victory over France, unity was formally proclaimed. A German empire was created, bringing together numerous states under a single emperor. The ceremony itself was charged with symbolism, yet the structure of the new nation reflected its origins. Power remained concentrated in the hands of the state, with limited parliamentary influence. Unity had been achieved, but on terms shaped by authority rather than popular will. For many, the new empire represented stability and recognition. Germany was now a major power, confident in its industry, science, and military strength. Education expanded, cities grew, and national pride found expression in culture and achievement. Yet beneath this confidence lay unresolved tensions between tradition and change, authority and participation. The unification had been swift efficient, and incomplete. It created a state, but not a shared political culture. Loyalty to region and class persisted alongside national identity. The empire moved forward with purpose, but its foundations remained uneven. As the new century approached, Germany stood poised between assurance and uncertainty. Its strength was real, its ambitions expanding, and its place in Europe newly defined. What remained unclear was how this power would be used, and at what cost. The answers would emerge not in a single decision, but through a series of choices that slowly drew the nation toward a far more turbulent chapter of its history. As the 20th century began, the German Empire moved with a sense of momentum that felt both natural and restrained. Industry expanded steadily, cities filled with workers, and scientific and technical achievement became a source of quiet pride. Railways, factories, and schools reshaped the landscape, drawing people into rhythms governed less by seasons and more by schedules. Life felt ordered, purposeful, and increasingly modern. Yet beneath this surface of progress, tension accumulated. Political power remained concentrated, and many citizens experienced national strength more as expectation than participation. Social divisions deepened as industrial wealth contrasted sharply with working conditions in crowded urban neighborhoods. The state functioned efficiently, but it did not always listen closely. Stability was valued, sometimes at the expense of flexibility. Germany's position in Europe also shifted. As a unified and rapidly developing power, it sought recognition equal to older empires. Diplomacy became cautious and competitive. Alliances formed and hardened, not necessarily with the intention of war, but with the assumption that preparedness was essential. Military planning, once a tool of security, gradually shaped thinking itself. When war finally came in 1914, it arrived through obligation rather than desire. Decisions made in moments of urgency set vast mechanisms in motion. Mobilization unfolded with precision, and initial confidence was widespread. Many believed the conflict would be brief, resolved through discipline and resolve. The reality proved otherwise. The First World War stretched time and endurance. For soldiers, it became a world defined by trenches, routine danger, and waiting. For civilians, it meant scarcity, anxiety, and the gradual erosion of normal life. Industry turned toward survival rather than growth, and loss became familiar, though never accepted. As years passed, exhaustion replaced conviction. The war ended not with clear victory or defeat, but with collapse and uncertainty. The empire dissolved, and the structures that had defined authority for decades fell away quietly. In their place stood a republic, fragile and burdened by responsibility it had not chosen. The Weimar years were marked by contradiction. Cultural life flourished even as political life remained unstable. Democracy existed, but trust was thin. Economic crises shook confidence, and memories of loss lingered. Many longed for order, for meaning that felt solid and enduring. In this atmosphere, voices promising restoration and clarity gained attention. They did not emerge overnight, nor were they universally accepted. They grew gradually, feeding on fear, resentment, and the desire for certainty. The path toward the next transformation was not obvious, but it was forming, shaped by unresolved wounds and quiet desperation. Germany moved forward into the interwar years carrying both remarkable creativity and deep unease. The balance between them was delicate, and as the decade closed, it became increasingly difficult to maintain. What followed would draw the nation into a chapter defined by total commitment, profound destruction, and consequences that would echo far beyond its borders. The shift that followed did not happen in a single moment, nor did it feel inevitable to those living through it. It unfolded gradually, shaped by fatigue, uncertainty, and a longing for coherence in a world that felt increasingly unstable. Many Germans were not seeking extremity. They were seeking relief from confusion, from the sense that life had slipped beyond reliable structure. Political radicalization grew in this atmosphere of strain. Democratic institutions existed, but they were fragile, constantly tested by economic shocks and social division. When stability faltered, confidence in compromise weakened. Voices that promised clarity, unity, and restoration found a receptive audience, especially when they framed complexity as betrayal and uncertainty as weakness. The rise of National Socialism was rooted as much in emotion as in ideology. It offered a narrative that simplified the past and projected certainty onto the future. Symbols, rituals, and repetition created a sense of belonging that transcended everyday hardship. For many, this felt like order returning, even as freedoms narrowed quietly and dissent receded from view. Once in power, the new regime moved swiftly. Institutions were reshaped to serve a singular vision. Independent organizations were absorbed or eliminated, and loyalty became a measure of safety. The state presented itself as permanent and all-encompassing, drawing individuals into its purpose through obligation and expectation. Participation was framed as duty, refusal as isolation. Foreign policy followed a similar logic. Germany's leadership pursued expansion not only for strategic reasons, but to reinforce the image of strength at home. Early successes were interpreted as validation, encouraging further risk. Each step made retreat more difficult, binding the nation's identity ever more tightly to action and momentum. When war returned in 1939, it did so under the weight of preparation and belief. At first, movement was rapid and confidence high, yet the scale of the conflict soon exceeded any previous experience. What became the Second World War was total in nature, drawing every aspect of society into its reach. Industry, science, culture, and family life were reshaped around the demands of conflict. As the war expanded, its moral dimensions grew darker. Policies driven by exclusion and dehumanization led to systematic violence on an unprecedented scale. These actions were carried out through bureaucracy as much as brutality, revealing how ordinary structures could be bent toward extraordinary harm. The consequences would leave wounds that could not be quickly closed. By the final years of the war, destruction was pervasive. Cities lay in ruins, infrastructure shattered, and civilian suffering widespread. Defeat, when it came, was unmistakable. The collapse of the regime was rapid, but its legacy was heavy, carried in memory, loss, and responsibility. In the aftermath, Germany faced a silence unlike any before. Not the quiet of recovery, but the stillness of reckoning. The future could not be approached without first acknowledging what had been done, and what had been allowed. From this pause, difficult and necessary questions would emerge, shaping the long path toward renewal that lay ahead. The years that followed defeat were defined by stillness and division. Germany did not move forward all at once. It paused, surrounded by ruins both visible and unseen. Cities were broken landscapes of stone and dust, while families navigated absence, of homes, of certainty, of those who had not returned. The immediate task was survival, yet beneath it lay a deeper challenge: how to live after collapse. Occupation divided the country into zones, each shaped by different priorities and systems. What had once been a single state became two distinct paths. In the West, Reconstruction was guided by integration with democratic institutions and market economies. In the East, a socialist state emerged, emphasizing collective structures and ideological alignment. Both claimed legitimacy, and both were shaped by the wider tensions of a divided world. Rebuilding was gradual but persistent. Physical reconstruction brought employment and purpose, while new political frameworks aimed to prevent the concentration of power that had led to catastrophe. In the West, economic recovery fostered a cautious optimism. In the East, stability was pursued through control and surveillance, offering security at the cost of openness. Daily life adapted to these realities, often pragmatically rather than enthusiastically. Memory played a central role in this period. The past could not be ignored, yet it could not be fully confronted all at once. Public reckoning unfolded slowly, through trials, education, and generational change. Silence and reflection coexisted, sometimes uneasily. The question of responsibility lingered, shaping national identity in ways that resisted simple resolution. The division of Germany hardened over time. Borders became walls, both literal and psychological. Families were separated, histories diverged, and shared experience gave way to parallel narratives. Yet cultural connections persisted quietly, through language, tradition, and memory, maintaining a sense of common origin beneath separation. As decades passed, the contrast between the two German states became more pronounced. Economic disparity grew, and the desire for movement and expression became increasingly difficult to contain. Change did not arrive through force, but through accumulation of dissatisfaction, hope, and the quiet courage of individuals. When division finally ended, it did so with surprising calm. The reunification of Germany was not without difficulty, but it marked a turning point, grounded in restraint rather than triumph. Integration required patience, empathy, and adjustment on all sides. Germany emerged from this long process more cautious, more reflective. Its modern identity was shaped not by a single narrative, but by layers of experience, loss and recovery, division and connection. The nation stood aware of its past and careful with its future, preparing to navigate a role defined less by dominance and more by responsibility, as the final chapter of its long history continued to unfold. In the years since reunification, Germany has moved forward with a measured sense of presence, aware of the weight it carries and the ground it stands on. Change has continued, but rarely in haste. The task has been less about redefining identity than about learning how to hold many identities at once, regional and national, historical and contemporary, without forcing them into a single shape. The rhythms of daily life settled into a quieter confidence. Cities rebuilt themselves not only with glass and steel, but with memory carefully preserved. Old streets were restored alongside new districts, and spaces once marked by division became places of ordinary movement. The past remained visible, but it no longer defined every step. It existed as context rather than command. Germany's place in Europe evolved in parallel. Cooperation replaced rivalry as the guiding principle, and institutions were built to manage shared challenges rather than contest power. Leadership, when it appeared, was often understated, expressed through stability, negotiation, and continuity. The lessons of history shaped this approach, encouraging restraint where others might expect assertion. Culturally, the country embraced reflection. Literature, film, and public discourse returned again and again to questions of responsibility, memory, and belonging. These were not exercises in self-judgment alone, but attempts to understand how history lives within the present. Education emphasized context, complexity, and awareness, passing these habits quietly to new generations. Economic strength returned without triumphalism. Industry adapted, technology advanced, and social systems evolved to meet changing realities. Debates continued, as they always do, but they unfolded within a framework that valued process over outcome. Stability was not assumed, it was maintained. What emerges from this long arc is not a single conclusion, but a pattern. Germany's history has been shaped repeatedly by tension between unity and diversity, authority and autonomy, movement and pause. Each era left traces, influencing how the next unfolded. The modern nation carries these traces with care, neither erasing them nor allowing them to dominate. At night, when the noise of the day fades, this history feels less like a sequence of events and more like a slow conversation across centuries. Forests and rivers remain, as they did at the beginning. Towns still gather around paths of movement and exchange. People continue to live within structures shaped by choices made long ago, often without realizing how deeply those choices reach. The complete history of Germany is not a straight line nor a single story. It is a layered landscape, shaped by patience and disruption, by loss and rebuilding, by quiet endurance. Understanding it does not require urgency, only attention, the willingness to listen as one moment passes gently into the next. And so the story rests here, not finished, but settled for now, continuing softly beyond the edge of this telling, as history always does.